When we think of Egypt today, we think of the camel, a dromedary or single-humped camel. But there's no ancient Egyptian word for a camel, and very little evidence for camels in Egypt until the Roman period. In fact, for the ancient Egyptians, the principal beast of burden throughout the pharaonic period was the donkey. The ancient Egyptian word for a donkey was an onomatopoeic word, a word they came up with listening to the sound the donkey made. In fact, this word was also used for donkey load, so a vague measure of quantity for bulky goods that might be carried by a donkey. If we look at ancient Egyptian representations of donkeys, and they're numerous, we see that they wore a saddle pack, a basket or leather sack fastened onto the donkey's back over a woven linen saddlecloth, fastened with ropes and straps. The average price of a donkey in ancient Egypt was the same as that of a cow or a coffin, which would have been pretty expensive. But it would have been a good investment, as a donkey can work for as many as 40 years. It's easy to maintain, and it can survive on relatively little water and poor forage, including desert scrubs. Donkeys are shown carrying grain from the field to the threshing floor. You can see the kind of load they can carry, but the donkey seems to be straining slightly under the weight. The donkeys themselves might then also be used to thresh the crops. This is a modern copy of an ancient Egyptian tomb scene, showing donkeys on a threshing floor. By trampling on the harvested crops with their hooves, they loosened the edible part of the emmer wheat or barley from the straw. The ancient Egyptian scenes of humans and animals interacting are often extremely lively. You can see sacks of grain being manhandled onto a donkey that is being kept still by one man pulling its tail and another man grabbing the donkey in a headlock. The inscriptions tell us that donkeys carried supplies to the men in the quarries, and in fact stone back to the Nile Valley. We also know that there were donkey caravans carrying trade goods on expeditions from Nubia to the south of Egypt, back into Egypt itself. We very rarely see depictions of people riding donkeys, although they probably did, as they do in Egypt today. This is a modern line drawing of an ancient depiction of a man riding a donkey side saddle, and another Egyptologist copy of a tomb scene. It's one example of a representation of a man sitting on a wooden seat on the back of two donkeys. One would imagine that could have been rather precarious. You see the scene itself here, or one very similar, and you can see it's quite difficult sometimes to make out the ancient raised relief. And that's why Egyptologists often talk about these scenes by looking at modern drawings of them. Although the donkey was so important to the ancient Egyptians, it's interesting that their god Seth, that they associated with chaos and infertility and all that was extremely difficult in ancient Egyptian life. It's interesting that Seth was sometimes represented as a donkey, or at least a human, as we see here, with a donkey's head. This is a representation of Seth as a demon on a magical papyrus.